is probably on everybody's mind, as Jerusalem has been and continues to be and will be a core issue. Recently, it has been in the news. I can't tell you, I'm from the district of Jerusalem, how many times Jerusalem have been leveled down only to rise again. The last panel, I'll leave the rest to the panel, the Jerusalem, a core issue, will be moderated by the Secretary of the Board of the Jerusalem Fund, Mr. Omar Faiz. Omar is a young lawyer, a young Chicago lawyer. I hear about that, Chicago lawyer. He is a very active member of a lot of organizations, including the American Bar Association, Arab American Bar Association, Chicago Bar Association, and the Chicago Commission on Human Relations. He has been very interested in human relations and human rights. More importantly than any, for a young lawyer, he serves as pro bono counsel for several non-profit organizations, and pro bono means you do it on your own dime. You don't get paid. And he has published, whenever some of these organizations have a tough problem, to my knowledge, usually they go to Omar. The price is right there, and the results are right. I don't think that anybody has been able to get him a better end result than what he has been. He has published on legal and political issues extensively, and he will moderate the last panel. Omar?
Thank you, Dr. Ali. I think youth is in the eye of the beholder. Those days have long gone. So today's topic is Jerusalem, a core issue. Historically, there's probably not been a more significant city in the world when it comes to political issues. Since the days of the Crusades all the way until today's news, you see a lot of issues that go on in that city. It's a city that has been in constant turmoil in the last 40 years. Even though we don't always see it in the news, we can't forget what's going on there. The constant displacement of Palestinians that are from Jerusalem, that are legal Jerusalem residents, have been denied their own rights as well as their own houses and are continually being removed. Today, we even see more that's going on. Secretary of State John Kerry was recently commenting, and he called it a potential fire that can go out of control. There's been a dramatic spike in violence by people in Jerusalem against Palestinians that live in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount has been recently closed, and for the first time since 1948, the Jordanian government withdrew its ambassador. And you have to think of all the things that have gone on in that area. For the first time to do that, you know there's something significant happening there. At the very question of Palestine, both geographically and symbolically, politically, economically, socially, is Jerusalem, a city that could not be more divided despite being under unified illegal annexation by Israel. So today we're going to talk about what changes have taken place in Jerusalem, the past, the present, and even the future, and what rights are going to be afforded to Palestinians and how to protect them. Today we have three very, very phenomenal speakers. I thank everybody for staying for the last panel. I know it can be a long day and gets a little warm, but I assure you that these are going to be three dynamic speakers that are going to have a lot to say. Our first speaker is Professor Issam Nassar. He is a Palestinian historian of photography in the Middle East and a professor of history at the Illinois State University, as well as a research fellow at the Institute of Jerusalem Studies in Jerusalem. And there's more bios, by the way, more in detail in your program, so I'm just going to go over these quickly. Our second speaker today is the well-known Professor Thomas Aboud. He is a professor of anthropology and Arabic programs at Tufts University. He's received his PhD at Columbia University and currently has a new book that I encourage you to look for, a 2014 book called Colonial Jerusalem, The Spatial Construction of Identity and Difference. And a very well-written book, and again, something that I hope that we can have him back here for maybe a book signing later. And number three, and last but not least, and my favorite, because she's simply a lawyer like myself, is Diana Butsu. If you haven't heard of Diana Butsu, you're not opening up your internet very often. She is a lawyer that specializes in negotiations, international law, international human rights. She has been just all over the place. If you could not find a better person to look out for you, she has written extensively. She works hard. She has graduated from Toronto University, or University of Toronto. She received her degree in law from Queen's University, an LLM from the University of Toronto, a JSM from Stanford, an MBA from Kellogg School at Northwestern. She's been a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and the Harvard School of Law, as well as the Stanford Center for Conflict Resolution Negotiation. Her resume is unparalleled. I encourage you to meet her after this as well. So let's get to the meat of this. You didn't come to hear me speak. I will start with Professor Issam Nassar, and welcome.
Thank you, and thanks to the Center for this invitation and for this amazing conference so far. I'm afraid I'm a historian, so I'm gonna be taking you to history a little bit, but it bears a lot on the present. Jerusalem entered the 20th century as a multi-cultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious city. It was, in fact, a city. It was the city in Palestine, not only because of its religious heritage for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but also because it was the administrative capital of the district of Jerusalem in the Ottoman Empire. And it had, in the early decades of the 20th century, a growing number of schools, organizations, centers of learning, and eventually a vibrant newspaper publishing and other things. Memoirs from people who wrote from that period, be it Jews or Palestinians, give us a glimpse of how open the city was. In fact, we learned, for example, that the naming of the old city into quarters named Christian Quarter, Jewish Quarter, Armenian Quarter, what did I leave? Muslim Quarter, was really a policy of the British that did not exist before. That holy places were open for everyone. That the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock was a cultural center where people just went there for the space to meet and to sometimes to listen to music or to talk, to have lectures, including to have picnics. And those people were not Muslims only, they were all members of the society. So the ban on the entry of non-Muslims to that site, for example, was also a British policy that was introduced in the little bit before 1920. So in a way, in contrast to what we have today, it seemed like we had a city, and now we don't. We've lost, in a way, I mean, not only as Palestinians we lost Jerusalem and we lost our properties and we were expelled and not allowed in, etc., but as a city, it lost what made it a city. It lost its center. It lost its places where people connected together. And since the late 19th century or second half of the 19th century, Jerusalem grew outside of the walls. And new neighborhoods were emerging all over the place. Some were predominantly Jewish because they were built like Mea Sha'arim with funding for that came particularly to build a neighborhood for the ultra-Orthodox Jews. Others were individual projects where people just moved outside, be it Christians or Muslims or Jews. And the result is, by the time 1948 approached, Jerusalem was a vast city, basically. I think I have a slide here. It was a vast city. If you can see over here, that's the old city, which is basically here. So this is 1947. So you can imagine Jerusalem was a vast city with various neighborhoods, mixed in some cases, and in some cases less mixed, but at least living next to each other, cooperating on one level or another. And then in the UN partition plan, the vision for Jerusalem was as you can see in red, that Jerusalem will represent a special district under international control, and the Jerusalem that was defined was a lot larger. Again, the old city is a small dot in the middle, what used to be old Jerusalem. But in 1948, particularly, a lot of that was lost. Not only was the city partitioned at the time between Jordan and the newly created Jewish state, but demographically it changed. And it lost its center, and it's lost its being a city that attracted different people to interact together. On the Jewish side, I would say it was replaced by Tel Aviv. And on the Palestinian side, maybe now it's being replaced by Ramallah, but I'm not sure. In April 1948, the fighting was very strong around Jerusalem, and we know of the massacre committed in Deir Yassin. But massacre in Deir Yassin was on the 8th of April 1948. By the end of April 1948, Jerusalem was already divided practically on the ground, even before there was a declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel. And the southern and the western suburbs of Jerusalem fell under the control of the State of Israel. And in the process, by the end of April 1948, about 30,000 Palestinians who lived, that is Christians and Christians and Muslims, found themselves basically, or had fled Jerusalem, or were expelled, partly by fear and partly physically were attacked, to the parts of Palestine that were under Jordanian control. And when we think of the question of Palestine in general, we tend to think of a number of issues: statehood, status of Jerusalem, settlements, and we also tend to think about refugees. Our image, at least in the Palestinian national discourse, one core issue has been the refugees. And to us, the refugees are often defined as those people who lived in refugee camps, who lost their villages, orchards, what have you. But we don't actually have any room in our Palestinian national narrative for the few hundreds and possibly a couple thousand, there is a debate about the number, of Palestinians who actually stayed in the part of Jerusalem that became or that fell under Israeli control. And using, just to give you an idea, this is the area that was called Mandelbaum Gate. This was the house of a rich Jewish man called Mandelbaum, which is now a UN building. And this was the only crossing point between both sections of Jerusalem between 1948 and 1967. And that crossing point was only for European foreign diplomats, and United Nations workers. On occasion, the Israelis would allow some Christians from the Galilee to cross for Christmas into Jerusalem and then come back. But generally speaking, this was a gate that served, as far as the people of Palestine were concerned, as a one-way road exit from what became Israel into the Arab world or into the Jordanian-controlled areas of Palestine, never to be able to return. Now, based on, and this is basically the checkpoint itself at the time, based on a diary I found by this man, he died in the early 1950s, his name is Jiryas Salti. Jiryas Salti was one of the few people who stayed in his neighborhood known as Al-Baqa. Al-Baqa is a southern neighborhood of Jerusalem that fell to the Israelis practically, or to the Haganah forces at the time, practically by April 29th, 1948. Salti kept a diary, we can see here, in an old notebook. He changed the dates up, and he wrote every day what he did. Outside of this context, it's probably the most boring diary about, we found cucumbers in the market, or stuff like this, nothing important. But within the diary, you see and you feel the desperation of this particular situation, of this Palestinian population that was left in between, that was left in the middle. They were not with the refugees or with the rest of Palestine, and they were not really in the Jewish state. They were excluded from the Jewish state in every possible way. These are images of the attacks on West Jerusalem. This is the Palmach forces, a Zionist paramilitary group, attacking the village of Ain Karim in this case. And this is an actual image of Palmach forces attacking Al-Baqa, particularly the area I am talking about. And just to give you some images to break the monotony, these are images from Al-Baqa. This is the family of Zananiri, who built a very fancy home, Bauhaus architecture, which is in the picture over there, and this is the home today as it continues to stand. And this is a picture of another family, and this was taken on the 29th of April, 1948. And they are in front of their home. They look like they're going on a picnic, but in fact, they thought that since there is so many attacks, maybe it's time to get away for a week. So they're taking their stuff with them and going to stay with their relatives in the eastern part of the city, never to return to this day. Salti stayed with his family there, and this is a picture of the family. I don't have much time to get into it. This is another picture of the Dajjani family that stayed in there as well. Now, Salti gives us a glimpse of how impossible it was for a Palestinian, a non-Jewish person, to live in West Jerusalem. Salti basically informs us that for the whole year, he did not start writing in 49. His diaries are lost. I was able to locate only to find the 1949 notebook. And in 1949, starting on May 1st, he says that a year ago, I was doing this and that, and then, all of a sudden, all the people of Al-Baqa were gone. And then he starts to narrate his story gradually, through which you learn that for the whole year, he did not leave home much, except for extreme necessities. And most of the time, he was keeping low, because if the Israeli forces find him, it is possible they'll just grab him, and especially his children, the male children, young men, and will throw them across Mandelbaum Gate into Jordan. And that happened to his eldest two children. In fact, he gives us details about how the army will go, the police or the army, I'm not sure, will go around in their neighborhood at night with a loudspeaker telling people who wants to go to Abdullah, meaning who wants a ride to go to Jordan. And he also tells us all sorts of details. Unfortunately, I was planning to read you parts of the diary, but I probably don't have much time. But he tells us about all sorts of details about the paramilitary forces and Jewish immigrants' quarters who were just come into their neighborhood, basically, and take out any empty house, or in some cases, force people out of their homes and take it over. Lots of details about people who were killed, about attempts to have contacts with the Jordanian side via, I actually will show you a picture over here. Sorry, this picture is Beit Safafa, was a village near Jerusalem on the south that was partitioned between Jordan and Israel, and people would meet here and at the fence early in the morning before the Israeli soldiers come, in order to exchange things most of the time, mostly letters, but in some cases, Salti and his family played an important role in going to homes to fetch a mattress, for example, for someone who's on the Jordanian side and has nothing to sleep, or some clothes, or some of the hidden gold in the house, and at the same time to receive food that apparently was not available in the market in Israel at the time, including, since I mentioned, cucumbers and seeds, and he was fond of his liquor, arak particularly, which was not available at the time. We have full descriptions of how those squatters will come into each neighborhood and even remove tiles from the bathrooms in order to sell them. So we have full description of a major tragedy and people trying to hide, basically, living their life as if they are non-existent. But I think the most important element to me, since I don't have much time to finish with, is to remind you that one of the interesting things that I've never known until I saw this diary is that at some point in the summer of 1949, the Palestinians who were scattered in, Salti says 200 people. Rochelle Davis, who spoke this morning, put the number at 700. Ben Gurion in his diary put it at 2,000. So, you know, whatever the number is, were all gathered from the various neighborhoods in Jerusalem and placed in this area in black that was designated as Zone A. And Zone A was supposed to be an area where the Palestinians are placed and they cannot leave unless they get a permission, and they can continue to live their lives in the same way Area A, now under the Oslo Agreement, functions in one way or another, with the exception of president and all sorts of officials that the Area A right now have. And there they took the homes of other people, other Palestinians who left, and they had to pay rent to the state. And they were granted rights to stay there, an identity card, residency card, for renewable every 3 months. Now Israel is going back to this. Now they're talking about Jerusalem identities being renewable every 10 years. So there are things that suggest that from what we're seeing now is nothing new, obviously. And it should not even be called a peace process, because what we have with the creation of the Area A is really a repetition of the same policy that the Israelis had. And it's not only in Jerusalem, by the way. Haifa and Jaffa had also their Area A. But basically, after the zone was canceled, and they attempted to return to their own homes were now occupied by Jewish settlers. And they could not claim their homes, and they could not return to the homes they were supposedly renting at the time from the so-called guardian of absentee property. And that would be the reason for the Salti family in 1951 to leave. They basically had no place. Their homes were gone on both sides. In the zone, they're no longer theirs, and in their original homes were completely gone. I guess in way of conclusion, I would like to say that what we have today in terms of settler violence taking over of homes and the ability to disrupt the very fabric of Jerusalem as a city has a very, very long history. Well, I guess within our conflict has a long history associated with Zionism, but has been undertaken since 1948 and is not separated from the very structure of power that did this in 1948 and did it now. So in way of conclusion, I will just read you the paragraph written by Salti in October 23rd, 1949. He says, "It's now 6:45 a.m. and as I lie on my bed next to the window, I can see the Jews outside coming and going. I say to myself, when will the people of Baqa return to their homes?" Thank you.
Thanks to the organizers, my fellow panelists. Thanks everyone for coming out. This paper is entitled "Colonizing Jerusalem Still." And what I want to begin by saying is, though, as many of you know, it's not typically the lens through which Jerusalem or Israel-Palestine is examined through. Increasingly, it is, And what I wanted to argue, and what I want to argue today, is that it's important to understand Israeli governance, in fact, as colonial governance, Israeli power as colonial power. And the major dynamics, the major ingredients of this form of power, and it's perfectly clear to some of you already, but the ways in which space is used and the ways in which a certain kind of racial policy that imbues Israeli law and Israeli governance are crucial to the constitution of colonial power. In other words, this is not just about leveling a sterner rebuke against the Israeli state. I think analytically and scientifically it works. It describes what's been going on the last 67 or 68 years under Israeli rule, and before that, of course, under British rule. So issues relating to space and the racialization of space are really crucial here, and this is done by Israeli planners and officials and citizens in all sorts of ways, through changes since 48 in the land law, through discriminatory housing policies that many of you are familiar with, through pronouncements, through what I call the weaponization of myth, the kind of convergence of biblical myths with national myths that constitute a certain kind of Jerusalem and make it appear as though it's not only ruled exclusively by Israel, but should be. Sort of taken for granted, normalized, naturalized landscape in Jerusalem that Israel is continually, perpetually trying to create. It's also done, of course, through silencing the past and silencing other inconvenient histories, which my colleague has begun to articulate very nicely. In the interest of time, we're going to move through this very quickly. But of course, Jerusalem, especially in the corner of the Western world that we are a part of, is represented in a very peculiar way, as if it were a sort of magical place, a place that only had religious dimensions and only particular kinds of religious dimensions. National elements and national claims to the city, particularly among the Palestinians, are often negated or effaced. And it becomes a kind of representation that is deeply and radically depoliticized. It's a kind of portrayal or representation that Edward Said, who we'll be getting to in just a few moments, referred to as a representation that exists outside of history. And many of you are familiar with those sorts of representations. Looking at Israeli power as settler colonialism is important because settler colonialism is varied and various and it's diverse, but it has really as its core, and it differentiates itself from other forms of colonialism through a kind of logic of elimination. That is the replacing of one people with another. The Israeli effort at state building since 48 and even before, with the pre-state institutions like the Palestine Colonization Association, some of these settlers were honest. They were settlers who called themselves settlers, saw that they wanted to create a polity in which the Palestinians were not there. It wasn't about conquering the land and then exploiting the Palestinian labor, although Palestinian labor has been exploited. It was more about just getting rid of the Palestinians. And that's a marker of settler colonialism. This has begun in recent years to be discussed more and more. There are journals now and books increasingly written about Israel-Palestine that talk about it in this way. But actually, if you go back into the 70s to look at some of the trailblazing scholars who began to look at Israeli governance as colonial governance, you would have to start, perhaps, at least in English, with this very important work by the French scholar Maxime Rodinson, who is a Holocaust survivor and who in the early 70s, by the way, who has heard of Rodinson? He's one of the finest historians of the 20th century. He was a leftist and also an anti-Zionist Jew. And in the early 70s, along with a few others, I'm sorry? Well, he was the author of a book that really kind of got many people outside of Palestine and Israel thinking along these lines, entitled Israel, a Colonial Settler State, ? And he answers it in the affirmative because he looks at the history of the kibbutz movement and the moshavim and the kibbutzim and implicates them very deeply in the efforts to conquer the land of historic Palestine.
What year was
That book, I believe, came out in English in '73. Early, relatively early. Drawing from my colleague's excellent analysis of a few minutes ago, I want to, in looking at colonial power and looking at the way in which colonialism produces space and racializes space, try to also connect past and present. Because after all, as we know, the past is not even past. Faulkner said that, I think, and it's true. The past is not gone; it's not even past. One example that I'm going to show, will have to serve as not simply as anecdotal but as emblematic, is the home of Edward Said's family in the neighborhood of Talbiya. This was taken in about 15 years ago. And what the fate of this home and the transformation of this home, which was seized from the Said family in 1948, tells us a lot, I think, metaphorically about the transformation of Jerusalem under Israeli governance, under Israeli power. This home where Said was born in 1935 was also the site of displacement where he and his family, it was actually, the house was in the name of, I believe, his father's mother, but was he describes it as sort of a place where the extended kin network lived when they were in Jerusalem, and they were displaced in '48, and it was seized by the emergent nascent Israeli state. In recent years, though, it was originally given over to different people or families in Israel, and then in the '80s it was given over to a Christian fundamentalist evangelical group called the Christian Embassy from Texas to rent, and it was called the International Christian Embassy in Texas. Christian Zionist organization that raises lots of money for the state, has an anti-Semitic theology. You know the story. And they were given it, but in recent years, actually in the last 5 years, it was sold off to two brothers who live in New York, who have dual Israeli-American citizenship, and was transformed from the house into a multi-story apartment complex of luxury apartments. You can see maybe perhaps the first two stories of the original house, but what was done to that house and its transformations, I think, metaphorically say a lot about how Jerusalem has been expanded and radically reconfigured. And I want to say a little bit about that. I want to suggest, in other words, that Israel's efforts to normalize and naturalize the contemporary spatial order in Jerusalem under its sole control since '67, and the methods used can be read in the transformations of individual Palestinian homes like the Saids. I see in these hundreds of altered homes, and Issam was right, in West Jerusalem alone there were hundreds, if not a couple thousand Palestinian homes that were taken in this way. I see in these homes that have been largely lost, although the residents haven't given up their claim to it, but I see them not simply as individual cases of theft or appropriation, but as ideological artifice, metaphors for the manner in which Jerusalem has more broadly been transformed. How does this work, and what does this have to do? What do transformations of places, individual homes, parts of cities, the entire city itself have to do with Israeli colonial knowledge production? Well, for one, I draw a couple of important parallels, I think. For one, like the city's urban landscape, only the Jewish state or those it licenses have the authority to make structural changes to these dwellings, right? Like the city more generally. Palestinian authorship of or claims to individual homes, like Jerusalem more broadly, national claims, are in important ways silenced and negated, and we see this every day. Think of Orient House. Do you remember Orient House? That last little shred of what the Sultan was supposed to have squeezed out of the Israelis and also to have a sort of symbolic presence in Jerusalem, and was closed down, 15 years ago? In 2001, right after Faisal Husseini passed away. Another parallel that I think is important to think about, by the way, so there's a myth. When the Said family owned the house, they rented for a short period to the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber. And the one remnant of the one trace of the former home that the new developers have developed in these luxury condos is they kept the old Martin Buber mailbox with his name in Hebrew and in English, and have retained it. not Edward Said's mailbox, but Buber's. And it, of course, carries with it a great deal of cultural capital. I live in the house where Martin Buber lived. Interestingly, on Buber, after 48, so Buber never lived in the stolen Said home. That's a myth that's been kind of bandied about. But after 1948, he who was opposed to a Jewish state stayed in the Jewish state and was actually given another home in Tolbia, namely this one owned by the Sununu family, just down the street. And there he lived from 48 and 49 actually until his death in 65. And I'm writing about this now. There's a lot of ways in which his home was described in the popular Western press, and how the home never mentioning that it was a stolen home. And by Sununu, the Sununu family, I mean, of course, John Sununu. His grandfather owned this house. He wasn't born there, but he became governor of New Hampshire, and Mitt Romney surrogate. But at any rate, that doesn't change the fact that the family lost the home. A third parallel that's important, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. In the interest of time, I'll start to cut a bit. Another parallel I see between the ways these homes have been reconfigured and the city itself has been changed is the noteworthy parallel that between the reconfiguration of these homes and the changes done to the city more broadly relating to boundaries. As with alterations and expansions of these Palestinian homes, that is, building on top of it, but still retaining the idea that this is an Arab home sometimes, or a home that existed before 48, the Israeli-drawn borders of Jerusalem have proven malleable as well, and are changing and shifting as we speak. Any land contained, like the home itself, so you can build 4 stories on top of the original home, that is an Israeli property. You can add 20 floors. Interestingly, the New York Times correspondent based in Jerusalem lives in one such home, the home of Ghada Karmi, which was taken from the Karmi family in 48, and the New York Times built a 3rd story and onto a 2-story home, and this is where the present and many, I guess back to Tom Friedman, have lived in this stolen Palestinian home in the neighborhood of Katamon, or in West Jerusalem, at any rate. But the borders are also emblematic of this, because as Israel has shifted and redrawn the boundaries, and it's done so several times in the course of the wall that I'm about to talk about a little bit more, is expanding the city still further. There's an interesting paradox at work, because the city is at once said to be eternal and immutable and unchanging, and at the same time, the Israeli state has never stopped perpetually changing the city. So anything, the black line is the new course, meant to be the new course of the Israeli exclusively held Jerusalem municipality. I wish I had one of those little pointers to show you, but essentially in Jerusalem, the barrier is a wall. Many, I don't know what kind of defense this is, but many people who defend the divide or the barrier say, well, it's actually a fence. It's not a wall, as if that made it any less illegal. But in fact, around Jerusalem, and it's almost completed, it is in fact a wall, a concrete wall. Well, that wall, unlike the original Israeli-drawn municipal boundaries, which are much smaller, which I can't, let me show you this map. Okay, so the map in the far left is Jerusalem as Israel redrew the boundaries in 1967. Okay. By 2005, as the wall around Jerusalem becomes almost complete, or nearly complete, you have it in this black, the new planned or actually existing wall that exists. And that is meant, Israeli officials make no, they're not timid at all about saying that this is going to be, everything that falls within the wall is going to be Israel's eternal, unchanging capital. Let's not forget that Oslo, as a formula, set up this arrangement, spatial arrangement of areas A, B, and C, right? But many people don't understand that Jerusalem was actually an area D or an area J. It was one of these issues that were meant to be final status issues, negotiations that were meant to be completed in 1999, a long time ago. Well, what happened in the course of, say, between the early 90s during Madrid and 2014 is that the Palestinians did not secure a settlement freeze such that the Jewish settler population within Israel's unilaterally drawn boundaries just about doubled from about 100,000 to today to about 200,000 settlers. And many of the settlements that you see today, Har Homa, the expansion of Pisgat Ze'ev and the eastern part of the municipal boundary, were thickened and bolstered precisely during the period of Oslo. Let me just say in conclusion that it is 10 years ago, in June 2004, that the International Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice ruled that the wall or the barrier that Israel is building is in violation of international law, that it has to be dismantled, and that the international community has a responsibility to see the wall is torn down. This was an advisory opinion. It doesn't mean that this is going to happen, but it was acknowledged internationally to be a violation of international law. I will leave more contemporary conditions to my next colleague, Diana Bhutto, who will talk about them. And maybe at this point, because of time, I will just leave it at that. Thank you.
I first want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I want to thank the Jerusalem Fund, Palestine Center. I want to thank the board. And I most particularly want to thank you for staying for a long and full day. My comments today, my remarks today are going to be about contemporary Jerusalem and what's actually happening today. I just arrived late last night from Palestine, from Jerusalem, and I'm hoping to be able to impart a little bit about what's going on over there. What I want to talk about today is how the Oslo agreements, and in particular the negotiations process, has managed to do two things to Jerusalem. One is to put Jerusalem on the table as an issue that is to be quote-unquote negotiated, while at the same time taking Jerusalem off the table as an issue that is not to be negotiated. And the way that this has been done over the course of the past 21 years was first to include reference to Jerusalem in all of the negotiating documents, which I'm sure you're very well aware of, through the Declaration of Principles onwards. And that came at the insistence, of course, of the PLO. But given that Israel controls Jerusalem, it has successfully managed to put into place measures to actually take Jerusalem off of the table and to create both physical barriers as well as demographic barriers to remove Jerusalem from the negotiating table and make it a fait accompli. One of the first physical changes that has been carried out to Jerusalem was, of course, something that happened way back in the 50s with the declaration of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and then later with the annexation of Jerusalem post-67 and the redrawing of the municipal boundary. That physical change ended up having a great deal of demographic changes, which I will talk about shortly. But alongside the change in the municipal boundary that happened, which Tom was kind enough to leave a map up on the board for you there, alongside that physical change of the redrawing of the boundary, one issue that the Israeli government has continued to put in place since 1967 was this unstopped building and expansion of Israeli settlements in Jerusalem, which, as you can see, are marked on this map by, I think it's pink, the pinkish gray color. Now, the building and the construction of these settlements has not stopped since 1967. And it's not at all surprising that since, even during this last round of negotiations, when the Israeli government was announcing 13,000 new housing units, that many of those housing units that were being announced are in the Jerusalem area. It's also not surprising that the Israelis continue to insist upon building the E1 area that is specified out there, which, although lies outside of the municipal boundaries of Jerusalem, is also a means to take Jerusalem off the table. The other issue the other physical structure that has been put into place in Jerusalem in order to take it off the table was and is the wall that has been built and continues to be built in East Jerusalem and the environments of East Jerusalem. And this physical wall is both designed to mimic the municipal boundary of Jerusalem, but also designed to take in more Palestinian land. But in addition to taking more Palestinian land, what the Israelis don't want is they don't want more Palestinians. So their policy of erase and replace has been something that they've been doing since 1967, indeed since 1948. Now, these physical barriers that have been put into place, first the redrawing of the municipal boundary, the second being the settlement construction, and third being the wall that is put into place, have actually created a bureaucratic nightmare, in fact, bureaucratic warfare for Palestinians. And this bureaucratic warfare has been increasing since the start of Oslo in 1993, to the point where we are now, in which this bureaucratic warfare has turned into bureaucratic terrorism. What I mean by that is that the first bureaucratic measure that was put into place came in 1967, when Israel redrew the boundary and expanded the boundaries of Jerusalem. It was forced to take in 66,000 Jerusalemites who were living in those areas in which Israel took over. These people were given Jerusalemite IDs, being permanent residents, not being citizens of the State of Israel, but merely permanent residents, given the right to reside in Jerusalem, but provided that they show that remains the center of their life. The residency can be revoked at any time. Revoked at any time if another citizenship is established, or if the center of life is no longer Israel. And we saw that between the period of 1967 up into the current day, more than 14,000 Palestinians, the Israelis have revoked the residency of more than 14,000 Palestinians, including 4,577 Palestinians whose residency was revoked in the year 2008 alone, and 106 whose residency was revoked just last year. Now, the reason that this is important is because Israel is treating Palestinians as though they immigrated to Israel. In fact, that's the law that it's put under, rather than Israel coming to the Palestinians. And so it's, once again, this policy of putting people under a system of bureaucratic warfare. The second form of bureaucratic warfare came in the 1990s with the establishment with the signing of the Oslo agreements. Before that time, prior to the 1990s, Palestinians, it didn't matter from where they were, if they were from the West Bank, from Gaza, from the north, etc., had the ability to live in Jerusalem. But in the 1990s, with the signing of the Oslo agreements, suddenly Palestinians were pushed out. If you didn't have a blue, meaning a permanent residency card, you were no longer allowed to be resident within Jerusalem, which meant that you were either forced to move further into the West Bank, or remain in one of the areas that is not within the municipal boundaries but slightly out of it, or leave entirely. And up until 1994, the Israelis continued to accept, from the 1990s onward, the Israelis then instituted a new policy called family unification, which meant that if you were in such a situation, you're a West Banker married to a person who has permanent residency, who has a Jerusalem ID, you had to apply to the Israeli authorities to be unified with your family. This process up until 1994 was only allowed for men because the Israelis believed that there was no reason for a woman to be bringing in a male into Jerusalem, that wasn't something that goes within Palestinian culture. The specific quote is that the wife follows her husband, and therefore there is no reason to grant status to the male spouse. In 1997, the Israelis then changed the procedure. And the procedure became that rather than the spouse getting permanent residency, if they had applied for family unification, they were now subject to a new procedure of what's called a graduated permanent residency, in which they had to renew their status every 6 months. And so you can imagine, every 6 months you have to go back to the Ministry of Interior, prove that you're a resident, prove that Jerusalem is the center of your life, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 2002 comes along. The Israelis now freeze all family unifications, citing security reasons. But they generously, and I'm putting generously, I'm being facetious, indicate that they were going to allow a procedure for men over the age of 35 and women over the age of 25 to apply for this temporary permanent residency once again. Now, I'll have you know, given their generosity, that out of the hundreds of applications that they've received, so far only 33 have ever been granted. What this does is that it means that Palestinians who are married, who are in this mixed marriage, and I'm not sure why we call it mixed, given that all of them are from occupied territory, but those who are in this situation are either forced to do one of two things. They're either forced to leave and live in the West Bank, the remainder of the West Bank, or the spouse is forced to kind of go underground. And there are many, many stories that I can give you and examples that I can give you of spouses who have chosen to live in Jerusalem but who have gone underground. For those 33 families who have managed to be so successful in getting those temporary permanent residence permits, renewable every 6 months, there are numbers of conditions that are placed on them. Simple things like not being able to fly out of the airport. Another thing like not being able to drive in Jerusalem or in Israel. Little things that, as I said, bureaucratic warfare turned into bureaucratic terrorism. But a third measure that has been imposed on Palestinians that I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about is that the Israelis have also more recently, been instituting a policy of revoking health benefits to those Palestinians who are living in East Jerusalem. The difference, while in the revocation residency is revoked in the case where you cannot demonstrate that Israel is the center of your life, in the case of your health benefits, as long as you don't demonstrate that Jerusalem is not the center of your life, then your health benefits can and will be revoked. And so you can simply see that in the case of a family who has tried to seek some type of unification, somebody from the West Bank marrying somebody from East Jerusalem, and they're obviously not given a residency permit, they're forced to live in one of the areas such as Ramallah, etc. The minute that the Israelis find out that their spouse is living in Ramallah or Bethlehem, etc., their health benefits get revoked, which later becomes the first step to getting their residency revoked. And so all of this is the form of bureaucratic warfare / terrorism that they continue to impose on Palestinians who are living in Jerusalem on a daily basis. And I just want to share very quickly 2 short stories with you. One of them is of a family who's living in the Kalandia area, not where the checkpoint is, but further away from the checkpoint. I'm sure you all know Kalandia. This is a man who is a school teacher who, in 1967, was away from his home. He was actually getting married when the Israelis came around during the time of the census. And although his entire family ended up getting Jerusalem ID cards, the Israelis refused to give him a Jerusalemite ID card. He was eventually granted a West Bank permit, West Bank ID card, and was living in his house in Kalandia on the Jerusalem side of the wall for many, many years. Then suddenly the wall comes. And when the wall came, he was now technically illegal in his own home because the wall is in front of him, behind him. He is on the Jerusalem side of the wall. And so he needed to, and he still needs to, apply every 6 months to have a permit simply to stay in his own home. Problem doesn't stop there. Although his wife has a Jerusalem ID, his children have Jerusalem IDs, his brother, who actually lives in a house that's further deeper into the West Bank, has a Jerusalem ID. He still remains as the sole person who has a West Bank ID. And because of the fact that he's not allowed to go outside from his home to go into the West Bank, the Israelis have erected a special gate to get into Ramallah, that he has to press the buzzer whenever he wants to get in, to go through Kalandia to be able to do any of his basic shopping, etc. Another story that I want to share with you, and it's my last one because I'm running out of time, is the story of a family who also is a same situation of where the male is a Jerusalem ID holder, his wife is a West Bank ID holder, and they live in the Bethlehem area, but technically within the boundaries of Jerusalem. His wife got pregnant and had a baby, but was unable to get to any of the hospitals in Jerusalem to have her baby, and instead gave birth in her home under a very dire situation, calling in a doctor, a specialist, to help her with the birth. The doctor who helped her have the baby is a Palestinian doctor licensed in the West Bank, and sure enough, she has a baby. One would assume that the child would be able to get Jerusalem residency. No. When the family went to go apply for residency for this child, the Israelis did not believe that she was actually the daughter of this couple. And so in order to be able to get, finally to get her registered, her lawyers had to go through the process of doing something that you see on Maury Povich, which is to get a DNA test for the daughter to prove that she was indeed the child of this man who holds Jerusalem ID. All of this is to say that these day-to-day measures that we see that are happening on the ground are simply designed to get rid of Palestinians, to do it erase and replace, as Tom had alluded to. And this is why we are now seeing what we're seeing when it comes to the Haram al-Sharif, particularly when it comes to the Temple Mount faithful. This is a group that has as its specific aim, the destruction of the Haram, who stated it very clearly. And yet the Israelis have managed to transform this into an issue of simply prayer, right? The right to pray on a holy site. Whereas this is a group that has been paid for by the government, received government funding, active settlers, trying to replace the very sites of the very holy sites in Jerusalem. And it's this process of both the settlers and what they're doing, and the bureaucratic terrorism that I described, as well as the physical structures that have been in place, that the Israelis have managed to successfully take Jerusalem off of the negotiating table. And in fact, most of what you hear today by a lot of pundits, maybe excluding the people who are speaking here today, all of them, is that we simply have to accept the situation on the ground, and that these are settlements that are here to stay. You hear a lot of this. My big answer to that is that just in the same way that a settlement can be created, a settlement can be uncreated. And we have to continue to be pushing for the uncreation of these settlements. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. That was very interesting, along the lines of being somewhat depressing, but we will move forward as we always do. So we are here for some questions. Just give me 1 second. There's a web audience, so anybody who's watching us on the web, I encourage you to tweet us any questions at the Palestine Center, and you can follow us at the Twitter handle of #PCCONF2014.
Any of you can explain the legality of annexation?
She wins the prize for the shortest question. Go ahead, right here.
Hi, my name's Elena Farsach. It's a question and a comment. I've noticed very much in the media the use of the word Jerusalem in terms of when they're speaking about the Israelis, to say, speaking from Jerusalem, you know, Joe Schmo Lukowski says this. The idea that we have to be much more careful about when we use the word Jerusalem, and as we know, of course, the Congress, and now that we've got a lot of our friendly Republicans in, sorry for anybody who's a Republican, but they seem to be really wanting to go with the notion of moving the embassy, and how really crucial and horrible that would be. And that's the one of the few good things that the State Department has kept up with, is not allowing the embassy to be moved. But to be very careful when talking about Jerusalem and saying where you are. I've even seen this on Al Jazeera English.
Thank you. Anyone more question? How about the gentleman right here? I'll move around the side, I promise.
If I may, just a very quick announcement before that. I got permission, actually. St. Mark's on December 3rd, Jewish Voice for Peace has Omar Barghouti and Richard Falk and Rebecca Velkomison from JVP speaking on December 3rd at St. Mark's Anglican on the Hill. The question is for Diana. You addressed the kind of all kinds of issues, but one thing I'd like you to address is the centrality of Jerusalem historically as a transportation and commercial hub for, economic hub, really the center of economic life in the West Bank, and how that has affected both the people of Jerusalem who really are in limbo. They are neither here nor there, and also how it has affected the rest of the West Bank, economically and socially.
Okay, so we have a question about annexation, a question about the use of the term Jerusalem, and then the last question. So if the panel wants to answer that in however order they feel most compelled, I'm okay with that.
Did you want to speak about the Jerusalem? All right. Annexation is illegal. Short question, short answer. It's not only illegal, but all of the countries of the world, including the United States, have recognized that all of the measures that the Israelis are putting into place are illegal, which is why they haven't actually moved the embassy at this point in time. Should I continue with the other questions?
Well, I want to say something on that.
Yeah.
If Ian Lustig is still here, he has written a really brilliant piece entitled "Has Israel Annexed Jerusalem?" And if he's here, he can speak for himself. But his argument is the colonizers have taken it, they've built settlements there, but they actually haven't legally annexed it. So maybe if he's here, he could fill us in. But that's what he argues in the piece. But if annexation means appropriating land, colonizing territory, then yes, they have. But technically, he argues against it. Maybe you have something to say about that. Is Ian still here? Maybe he can chime in later, but at any rate.
And Dr. Nassar, you might be able to comment on the issue of the historical significance and commercial center of Jerusalem.
If I understood Philip's question right, it's probably referring to the post-1967 Jerusalem and its role in the West Bank, as Jerusalem had the only advanced Palestinian hospital. Jerusalem had the only Palestinian theater, because of the differences in law applied in the rest of the West Bank, the military law versus the Israeli law. There was the ability in the 1970s and 80s for Palestinians to establish trade unions in Jerusalem, to establish newspapers, all sorts of things. So for my generation who lived through that period, Jerusalem was the center. If you needed to go to a doctor, you needed to go to Jerusalem. If you wanted to see a movie theater, you went to Jerusalem. If you wanted to read newspapers, some of them were banned. All the Palestinian newspapers written by people who might have lived in Ramallah or Bethlehem even were banned in these areas according to military law. So the Oslo process and, well, at least before it became formally Oslo process, in 1992, mid-1992, I guess the PLO and Israel were already negotiating. Yitzhak Rabin already decided to close Jerusalem off for Palestinians from the West Bank. And of course, then the peace process came and everything we know, and where all these services and the centrality of Jerusalem as a social, cultural, political center was completely replaced. To a level that today we see many of the old businesses, Palestinian businesses whose name is associated with Jerusalem, opening up in other places. Some of, like the suites of Zalatimo that, we have pictures from late 19th century of Zalatimo in Jerusalem. Now Zalatimo is in Ramallah. So, and now instead of most people of Ramallah and Bethlehem and others just going to Jerusalem, they can't. And now people of Jerusalem, if they want to interact or see, participate in social or cultural activities, they go to Ramallah. So in that sense, the Israelis were very successful in removing and destroying the centrality of Jerusalem in the life of the West Bank in that sense.
Why don't we go towards that end? So, how about the gentleman in the yellow in the corner? His arm's getting tired.
Thank you. My name is Harry. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, the home of John Hagee. You're welcome. My question isn't specifically about Jerusalem, but perhaps about colonialism. The Knesset either recently introduced or is getting ready to introduce legislation making putting settlers under civil jurisdiction, not military. My understanding is this is legally an extremely important step in making, in moving toward annexing the settlements. And so my question is it an extremely important step, and is it sort of a foreboding of annexation and de facto establishment of, or doing away with anything remotely resembling a state for Palestinians?
Another question? How about the young lady in the back?
Hi, my name is Tanya. I'm with Arab America. What role does the sacred sites play, or what role do they play as far as negotiation is concerned? And does the religious element that surrounds the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is that the major difference between, say, South Africa and Palestine? Because I'm really trying to understand what are the differences between India, other colonizations, India, South Africa, you know, the list goes on and on, Australia, Canada, this country, but is it the religious element that is really preventing us from moving forward? As in particular, not just in Jerusalem, but in general.
Diana, can you address the gentleman's question about the annexation, the legality of those terms and what's being done in the West Bank?
Sure. Actually, first wanted to address, there was a question about using the term Jerusalem.
Oh, yes, there was a question about that. My apologies. Go ahead. Thanks for making it.
So in terms of using the word Jerusalem, I think we have to push back on the idea that Jerusalem is Israel. And I think we also have to push back on the idea that we always refer only to East Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is, referring it to only as East Jerusalem is actually a major concession, because so far no country around the world has recognized this division between West and East, and continues to hold on to the idea that Jerusalem is a corpus separatum, which is again why there's this issue now going before the courts about whether it's going to be Jerusalem, Israel on the passport. So I think I get what you're saying, that that Jerusalem has now become code for Israel, and we have to push back on that, but we also shouldn't be constantly clinging to this idea of simply talking about East Jerusalem. On the issue of the introducing legislation to put it under civil and not military jurisdiction, it hasn't passed yet. It's gone through a number of different readings, and it's gone through the committee stage, but it actually hasn't passed. But I want to be clear. Israeli settlers are already under a certain form of civil law that Palestinians are not under. And this is particularly in the realm of criminal issues. If a Palestinian is arrested and an Israeli settler is arrested for the exact same crime, the Palestinian goes under an Israeli military court, the settler goes under an Israeli civil court. So there already is a bit of a distinction when it comes to the application of laws, which is why it's apartheid. Right? But what they're talking about in terms of extending the law to apply Israeli civil law to those settlers has more to do with the issue of planning and the planning regime that's associated in terms of whether a structure is illegal or legal, and whether a structure becomes legal or illegal goes under an Israeli military system or whether it goes under a civil system. There are other issues as well, but this is one of the main differences. And yes, it is a step towards annexation, but this is a step along the lines of many other steps that have already been taken that are more physical in nature. And indeed, I've been arguing for quite some time that the Israelis don't need to go that physical step of annexation because they've already done it. And doing the de jure, actual legal annexation, won't gain the Israelis anything that they don't already have. In other words,
It doesn't legitimize it more in the
it actually delegitimizes it more, because this is one thing that the international community has been pushing back on. This is why the Israelis are very clever and have been doing taking measures, or putting into place measures that de facto lead to annexation, but aren't actual annexation. Whether that is the fact that certain areas are off limits to Palestinians, whether it's the roads that are off limits to Palestinians, whether it's the application of civil law, particularly in the cases of criminal issues. All of these things these are measures that are de facto annexation that the Israelis have put in place for quite some time. The one last measure is this measure of the full application of Israeli civil law to the settlements, and they may just do it in the end, but I don't think they'll go the full step of declaring the territories annexed, because, as I said, they don't need to do that and get into a confrontation with states with countries around the world. They can do it as they already have done it on the ground.
Thank you very much. Tom, do you think you would be able to address the question about the significance of the holy sites and whether they are an obstacle to the peace process?
It's a big question. I mean, one part of that question I wanted to sort of zero in on was this idea of the nature of the conflict, which I think we have to resist this idea that this is a religious conflict. Can you all hear me? This is a national conflict over land that has that is a colonial context. It's between colonizer and colonized, occupier and occupied, not necessarily between Muslims and Christians or Muslims and Jews. This is on? This is my microphone.
That's just the honor.
Although it has a really important religious dimension to it. The myths that I was making reference to before that the Israeli nation state has tried to use to justify sole Jewish control over Jerusalem, it has a religious dimension, but it's a part of a colonizing process. I think that, yeah.
Sorry, my question was, what is the difference between India versus Israel and Palestine?
Well, I think
I understand it was colonized.
what I argue is, and what I try to make clear in my talk, was that Israeli colonialism is a specific kind of colonialism. It's settler colonialism. They're moving populations in and trying to displace and negate others. The British in India weren't doing that. They were colonizing. The French in Algeria was a settler colonial regime. There are different varieties, of course. The Israeli policies are meant to negate and erase Palestinian histories and to replace them. Not even South African style, because the Bantustans were a source of labor, right? It's not, the Palestinian labor is not what Israel's to exploit, is not fundamentally what Israel's want. They want them gone. And that's what they're doing. Although I agree with Diana, it is very similar to apartheid.
Please, go ahead.
If I may add
Yes.
something really quickly. The one problem with this kind of colonialism, settler colonialism, is that the Israeli state produced a historical narrative and a historical imagination to justify its project, claiming that it's not, a colonial project, but it's just the return of the Jews to their home, etc., etc. And in this narrative, this narrative has been religiously infused, not that religion and its basic tenets got into it, but it turned the Bible into a history. And so there is a great misuse of religion. And of course, the more it persists, the more the other side also is going to start to see the issue partly as religious, especially with the latest developments of attempts to take over or to partition possibly the Al-Aqsa Mosque in that sense. So, and that's probably the difference between India, Pakistan, and other places. And it's also the difference in the Catholic world, for example. You don't need, you're a Venezuelan Catholic doesn't mean that your holy sites or religious leadership should be in Venezuela, you know, or you're the Vatican doesn't mean that your Jerusalem needs to be controlled by you or Bethlehem or any other holy sites. This is a unique kind of use of discourse in order to justify what cannot be justified otherwise.
All right, well, unfortunately, we have time for one more question. This gentleman saw his hand first, and we'll start there, and then I'll invite Dr. Ali for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Benjamin Tua. Based on what we've heard over the course of the day, it's easy to despair. But despite Israeli efforts to get rid of the Palestinians, there are more Palestinians than ever in what was the Mandate territory. The population of Israel itself, the 48 population, is now 20%, despite all the immigration of Soviet Jews and so on and so forth. And the Palestinians have also changed the terms of the negotiation by going to international law, which is the way that the Israeli state was established and subsequently recognized. So building on Diana's remark about how a settlement can be created, it can also be uncreated, what kind of room is there for hope that we might be close to a solution of some kind that will have some semblance of justice?
Who's going to be the optimist here today?
Always leave it to me. You know, gosh, when I was preparing my remarks here earlier, when I was preparing my remarks, a friend of mine said, "Are you going to depress me?" And and I promised her that I wouldn't depress her, but I think I probably have. But look, there is a lot of scope for a lot of room for optimism, and I say this because I think there's a lot of things that are coming to a head. First is that the Palestinian even the Palestinian Authority has come to the realization that the peace process has failed. Okay? These are people who are invested in, as you heard Dr. Lustig speaking about in the last panel. Even they have come to a realization that this process has failed. Around the world, people are now realizing that this settler colonialism is not something that they should be applauding, and it is something that they should be condemning. And you are seeing more and more countries around the world that are becoming more vocal when it comes to the issue of Palestine. But I think the most important change is, and of course we obviously see the growing boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that is picking up and is making huge strides, despite the fact that it's really only been in place now for 8 years, a call that was made, 9 years ago. Okay. That being said, I think the biggest source of, for me, optimism is that Palestinians are no longer buying into this myth of the two-state solution as a solution, and that now the push and the recognition is that this isn't about drawing a line, because if it were about drawing a line would have been drawn a very long time ago, but that this is about two issues, liberation and return. And increasingly, more and more Palestinians are talking about liberation and return, and more Palestinians, including the ones in 48, like me and others, aren't buying into this idea of Israel as a democracy or Israel as being this great bastion for rights, but are actually resisting the system. And you're seeing now, particularly now, in spite of all of the things that the Israelis are trying to do in order to divide up the communities, in order to separate us from one another, and you saw these maps in which people are separated, that people are more and more coming together, and people are increasingly resisting. And you don't see it in the news coverage, because the news coverage can be quite abysmal. But there is a huge amount of resilience and resistance that is happening in Palestine today, whether it's the young Palestinians who are going out and protesting the power plan, or Palestinians who are going out and protesting the demolition 66 times of Al-Araqib in the Nakab, or people who are resisting the home demolitions, which we didn't get a chance to speak about, or even as something as basic as people who are smuggling out sperm from prison to get their wives impregnated. There are huge forms of resistance that aren't really being covered and that we don't see. But this is the reason why these numbers are increasing, and this is why whenever I come here, I actually am much more energized, because people are resisting. They haven't submitted despite 67 years of pressure for them to resist.
And it seems it's the Israelis who are living in Poland.
And look, and there's also, for me, the issue is not how the occupied, how the occupier is coping with their occupation. It's how the occupied are coping with the occupation. And so, yes, there are transformations as well within Israeli society. We can't speak of them in huge numbers because it is a very, very, very small number, and the right wing is increasingly growing in the country. But there is also starting to be a very, very, very there is a very critical left in Israel that is also recognizing that this is no longer sustainable. So there is huge scope for optimism. I don't see that it's going to come in any negotiated framework or in any negotiated solution. I think that it's going to be mostly to do with pushing the boycott movement, pushing divestment, pushing sanctions, pushing Israel's exclusion, pushing for Israel's isolation. And this is why the Israelis have invested so much money into trying to fight back on that.
Thank you. Sanctions have been the most effective.
Everybody, we've reached the end of our day, it looks like. On behalf of the third panel, just give me 2 minutes of attention. I would appreciate it. Thank you to Dr. Aboud, Dr. Nassar, and Ms. Bhutto for their time today, and thank you for your time and attention. Dr. Ali, President of the Board of Directors of the Jerusalem Fund, will have just 2 minutes of closing remarks, and thank you again.
Good afternoon. You have been a fantastic audience. I don't recall since I joined the board in 2000 that we had as many people at our annual meeting as there are today. You've been fantastic. What did we hear today? We heard 4 fantastic panels, which really encompass the issue of Palestine in a general way, in an overview. We heard about the refugees. That's the first panel. The longest lasting refugee problem probably in history. We've heard about the renewed media attention and the efforts of the activism and the young Palestinians on campuses. That's new. That was not on the horizon maybe 5-6 years ago as much as it's important right now. And we've heard about the failure of the negotiations, which started under first President Bush and Secretary James Baker and so on. And you've heard a very animated discussion of how the negotiations have evolved and morphed till today. And actually, you had a little bit of that with the presentation of Ms. Bhutto, who was part of the negotiations and has lived with them for. And then you've heard about Jerusalem. Right now, activity in Palestine centers around Jerusalem. And I'm reminded of one of the cover of the Washington Report, one of the organizations here in Washington, which had an old Palestinian gentleman raising a flag in Gaza on top of a demolished home and demolished car or tank or something, and he says, we will not disappear, and so on. Ladies and gentlemen, just as somebody who left Palestine 54 years ago, and I had to leave Palestine 54 years ago, and has witnessed what has evolved over the last 54 years, and have been involved. There's also, which was alluded to, there's also a new Palestinian generation. One of the panelists talked about possibly the negotiations will take a new turn from a new generation and so on, rather than those who are in power right now or who pretend to speak for the Palestinians. There is a new generation of Palestinians. And just a small anecdote. I was given. I've been in the U.S. Army since 1968, and I was given a speech at the university at Vanderbilt University in Nashville to retired Tennessee officers. Everybody was lieutenant colonel and above, and I told them, regardless of what my generation agrees to in negotiations with Israel, and the subject, of course, was Palestine, and my 19-year-old daughter, who was at Vanderbilt, and she became a lawyer too, just like our youngsters here, was in the audience. I said, regardless of what we agree to, what we may be forced to sign, this generation of my daughter will tear that document apart, regardless of what. And I'm optimistic and I'm hopeful, as Diane alluded to, regardless of what current folks who are in the negotiating table may be forced to agree to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, future generations of Palestinians will tear that apart. That signature is not worth ink that it is written with, or the paper that it's written to. This has been a fantastic audience. We've had a fantastic group of panelists and experts. I would like to thank I would like to thank you for being here at this late hour. We said, our program said we will finish at 4:45, and actually the moderator called it off at 4:45. And I'll take just a minute more and then let you go. We've had a fantastic program, and it didn't come just incidentally, just didn't show up on the program. It's because we have a fantastic staff, and I would like to thank the staff for all of it. Our staff of 5 also include our interns. They've always been an integral part. I want to thank our board essentially for showing almost in force here today, and promise you that our program next year will be no less interesting. It looks like things are not going to be solved between now. We have a new administration and a new Congress and so on. So see you next year. Thank you.